This chart displays the Arrow-Debreu equilibrium, the core assumption of classical economics. It posits that supply and demand will naturally intersect at a neutral, self-correcting price point. The efficient market hypothesis relies entirely on this geometric perfection, assuming that prices constantly reflect all available information, and that buyers and sellers interact as rational, equal participants. Empirical market behavior explicitly rejects that model. Instead of self-correcting, financial networks frequently undergo rapid, systemic avalanches. Orthodox models treat massive liquidity freezes and localized debt traps as statistical anomalies or unpredictable black swans. The data shows they are mathematically predictable consequences of deterministic phase transitions. The universal force equation treats a transaction as a physical collision between two distinct masses, a buyer and a seller. When we map their relative pressure against an invariant environmental limit, the resulting formula takes on a familiar shape. It is mathematically identical to the structure of mass-energy equivalence, or E equals mc squared. In relativity, c squared represents the universal speed limit of causality. You cannot negotiate with it. In economics, we substitute c squared with the dimensionless reality tensor. It represents the immovable physical boundaries of the host ecosystem, the absolute limits of a resource. Orthodox models assume a market composed entirely of rational calculators operating in an infinite void. By ignoring the thermodynamic boundaries and physical constraints that actually govern the material world, those models blind us to the exact mechanisms that trigger systemic crises. This diagram illustrates the well principle. You cannot simply draw water from the earth. You must construct the mechanism to access it. In our equation, this physical cost is measured as Rn. It represents the actual labor, energy, and prior structural investment required to produce a resource and bring it to market. We contrast that physical effort with the extraction ratio, or Ra. This measures the institutional scarcity, monopolies, and structural chokeholds imposed on top of the existing physical investment. It is a tollgate built over a well someone else dug. When the Consumer Price Index tracks inflation, it compresses both of these variables into a single, indistinguishable number. A price increase driven by genuine difficulty in physical production is recorded identically to a price increase driven by a monopoly extracting higher rents on an enclosed necessity. True economic value creation requires deepening the physical well to increase output. Modern financial extraction simply scales by erecting more tollgates over the critical infrastructure that society requires to survive. Expanding the reality tensor reveals the exact mechanism of that extraction. Systemic scarcity and physical renewability operate as hard thermodynamic limits. A high extraction ratio mathematically multiplies the systemic strain of whatever scarcity exists. We then map the relative urgency velocity to this tensor. This variable measures the pressure gap between a desperate buyer experiencing acute need and an indifferent seller facing zero biological consequence if the transaction fails. We apply the Lorentz-Agling transform to this velocity. As the urgency differential between the two actors approaches absolute maximum, their coordinate frames diverge. The buyer's willingness to pay loses all tether to physical value, and mathematical coercion spikes toward infinity. A patient requiring insulin operates at maximum biological urgency, while a pharmaceutical monopoly controlling a patented formula operates at near zero. This creates a frame divergence, where the transaction calculates against the patient's biological survival rather than the marginal cost of production. Under extreme urgency differentials, these agreements are mechanical extortion protocols. The extraction is limited solely by the mathematical point of the buyer's biological failure. This heat map models the 9x9 debt tensor matrix. It visualizes the exact thermodynamic valences of borrowing by plotting capital scarcity on one axis against borrower urgency on the other. In the bottom right exothermic zone, lending capital is abundant and the borrower's urgency is low. Debt taken under these conditions acts as a productive leverage multiplier. The transaction creates more thermodynamic capacity than it consumes. The top left endothermic zone maps the inverse state. When credit is constrained and desperation is critical, the lender operates as a local monopoly. The loan ceases to be a tool for growth and becomes an extraction mechanism, stripping existing capacity from the borrower to generate yield. Borrowers rarely jump directly into the extraction zone. They undergo a temporal fall into debt bondage. Compound interest operates as negative Posse gravity. Each cycle of unpayable interest increases the borrower's effective urgency and damages their credit profile, structurally forcing their trajectory upward and leftward toward the extraction zone. Debt is a vector. Once a borrower crosses the threshold of non-coercive need, the debt mathematically degrades their future thermodynamic capacity for every day they remain trapped in the matrix. To understand how this matrix is weaponized, we have to look at the balance sheet inversion. For a household, cash is an asset, and a mortgage is a liability. For an institutional bank, the rules flip. Cash sitting in an account is a liability they owe you, while your 30-year debt is their income-generating asset. This creates a structural vulnerability. Banks operate on fractional reserves, taking in your short-term cash deposits and transforming them into long-term loans for someone else. To survive and generate yield, the institution must constantly issue new debt to grow its asset base. The modern housing market is the primary engine for this manipulation. Banks utilize fiat credit elasticity to pump vast amounts of newly keystroked money into a geographically fixed supply of housing. This credit expansion continuously drives property values up. To secure basic biological shelter, the public is forced to take on larger and larger mortgages. The bank's core product directly inflates the baseline urgency of the entire population. The financial sector structurally requires the housing supply to remain highly scarce and highly urgent. If homes become abundant and affordable, the bank loses the high-yield collateral required to balance its own ledger. When we scale individual debt calculations to a macro partition function, the economy becomes an agent-based model. By artificially inflating localized urgency across millions of households, banks introduce massive structural strain. Borrowers max out their physical capacity to service compounding interest. As defaults begin, market temperature destabilizes. Informational friction spikes as institutions realize their collateral cannot clear the outstanding debt. When the extraction ratio hits its physical limit, the tensor demands infinite time to clear principal. These cascading defaults trigger an instantaneous mathematical liquidity freeze. This market freeze represents the physical death of the transactional vector. It occurs at the precise mathematical point where the system's extractive requirements exceed the thermodynamic capacity of the underlying network. When the vector dies, sovereign governments and central banks step in to prevent a total real economy freeze. They execute systemic bailouts, injecting theoretically infinite fiat liquidity to plug the holes on commercial balance sheets. Modern monetary theory correctly notes that a sovereign issuer of fiat currency faces no operational fiscal limits, but it ignores the geometry of capture. Handing unlimited spending capacity to an extractive institutional apparatus scales the power of the extraction. This is the Cantillon effect. Central bank reserves flow to financial institutions first, restoring toxic assets. During the boom, institutions collect yield. During the bust, survival is socialized. Currency dilution extracts the bailout cost directly from the working class. The accumulation of unpriced externalities and extractive debt creates a geometric limit that symbolic fiat cannot bridge indefinitely. Ensuring systemic resilience requires a medium of exchange tethered to the physical cost of production, with a formal mathematical cap on the extraction ratio.